Oscar Piastri makes his title intentions clear after winning the Bahrain Grand Prix from pole position, as Lando Norris recovered to third but still suffered several mistakes. Elsewhere, Max Verstappen described his race and Red Bull as a catastrophe, whilst Nico Hulkenberg was disqualified. For Racing News 365, my name is Nick Golding, and I'm delighted to be joined, as always, got there eventually, by lead editor Ian Parks. Ian, I'm going to quickly address this is like my third different background across the last 2 days. I'm now hiding in the corner of a meeting room, and I'm now started speaking. I've realized my voice is echoing everywhere, so everyone in the lobby can currently hear me, but it's fine. They can basically join this as like a live F1 update. It's good for them, really. But
Exactly.
Ian, let's start with the one thing we knew for certain. As soon as the checker flag fell again, a bit like qualifying, Oscar Piastri, a flawless display, converting pole position into victory, now just 3 points behind Lando. I mean, he's looking more and more like the real deal.
Title contender, absolutely. 2 wins in 3 3 Grand Prix weekends. Bearing in mind his victory in the Chinese Grand Prix, of course, just 3 weeks ago. So absolutely 3 points behind, as you've said. He's most certainly in this mix without a shadow of a doubt. And are we going to get one of those teammate intra-team battles over the course of this season between Lando and Oscar? It certainly looks that way. How much of a threat can Red Bull and Max be over the course of this season? What a difference a week makes, bearing in mind the performance that Red Bull and Max put in over the course of the Japanese Grand Prix weekend, and then coming into this weekend, pretty much not nowhere, but really clinging on to the shirt tails of McLaren and Oscar Piastri in particular this weekend. So yes, quite a title battle is starting to form. We've had 4 very different Grand Prix weekends now over these first 5 weekends. Lots up, yes, a lot more to come in Jeddah this upcoming weekend, because we go straight from Bahrain across to the next Grand Prix in Saudi Arabia. So yes, plenty to talk about and digest from the Bahrain Grand Prix weekend, because behind Oscar, they were just sailed into the distance pretty much. Obviously, yes, we had that safety car and that brought him back into focus. But apart from the race start and his first pit stop, he was nowhere to be seen on the TV screens because all the action was unfolding behind him. And behind him, actually, it was a pretty decent race, I thought, Nick. Lots of overtaking, lots of incidents, coming together, different drivers. But Oscar, as you say, flawless, and a weekend most certainly to remember for him, one that's absolutely cemented his position without a shadow of a doubt as a title contender this season.
I feel like this race is kind of made up for what we had to put up with in Suzuka last weekend, which was obviously not the best of races, whereas Bahrain, I thought, was absolutely brilliant. Now, we are recording this update probably about 30 minutes later than we usually would on a Sunday after the race, because we weren't too sure who would actually finish second. Of course, George Russell did cross the line in second with Lando Norris in third. However, George, of course, was under investigation, but thankfully, Ian, no penalty for George. He keeps P2.
Yeah, sorry, I'm just being distracted because I'm just going to show people this, because as you can
Go
imagine,
for
in
it.
the paddock, we've got people unpacking. All the teams are unpacking everything, getting ready to obviously very quickly fly off to Jeddah. So the reason why I was distracted, because just here, this was being a forklift truck was just depositing this one of these large crates, and I just have to keep an eye on that at the corner of my eye. Of course, I was being shielded and protected by someone, but yes, as I say, Nick, sorry, thoughts and focus just momentarily, as I say, distracted there. Sorry about that, folks. What was the
All
question,
good.
Nick?
George Russell, of course, crossed the line in
Yes,
second. We
sorry.
weren't too sure if he was going to keep P2 or if Lando would inherit P2. But in the end, though, no penalty for George in what was a pretty stressful end to the race for him.
Yeah, because obviously he had this major DRS issue, and basically it would not activate properly, and there was led to an FIA investigation into this, and a certain particular situation when he was not supposed to activate the DRS when he did do manually. So just to give people idea as to the stewards got that came in, no penalty for George on the back of it. despite the fact that they did discover that he activated manually the DRS when he shouldn't have done. Basically, there was a wiring loop failure due to a component supplied by an external supplier beyond the team. This was investigated, and it basically meant that George had to activate the DRS button manually, but it was also a button that coincidentally allowed him to talk to the team over the radio. So at one stage between turns 10 and between turns 11 and 12, he activated this button, but he was meant to talk to the team. Instead, it was the DRS activation button. Now, the specificity of the statement says that George activated the DRS for 37 meters in a 700-meter long straight. He gained a 0.02 second advantage. However, in fairness to George, at the very next corner, he eased off just a fraction by 0.028 seconds, which means he negated that very small deficit he had gained by accidentally activating the DRS button. Sorry, that sounded a little bit technical and complicated, but I think I've covered absolutely the minutiae of the reason why the stewards at the end of the day decided to let George Russell off, and he did not lose what is a crucial P2 for him and Mercedes. And of course, that with no penalty applied, that meant that Lando Norris, who tried his damnedest over those closing few laps to overtake George Russell, stays in third position.
What it means for George now as well, that it's 3 podiums from the first 4 races, and obviously for Lando as well, finishing third in what has been a really difficult weekend, one full of mistakes. Obviously qualified in 6th, was very unhappy after qualifying, made a mistake quite literally right at the start of the Bahrain Grand Prix, lining up beyond his grid slot, meaning he got a 5-second time, or eventually 5-second time penalty for that, which he took in his first pit stop. Progressed to third, but obviously at one point as well, also had to give a place back to Lewis Hamilton after overtaking him by going all 4 wheels. I tell you what, this is not going well today. All 4 wheels beyond the white. It's been a long few days, you know. All 4 wheels beyond the white line. He gave back the place, got Lewis back, got Charles Leclerc as well. Tried to get a George, as you mentioned, but also locked up massively at his best opportunity. He accepted himself that it was just too many mistakes. And it's again, though, another episode of us seeing this, where some weeks Lando is absolutely flawless, perfection. Other weeks, like this weekend, it's just one error after another.
Yeah, I remember we discussed after the Australian Grand Prix when Lando came flying out of the box.
Yeah.
Had a great weekend, nailed the victory, and we all thought, has Lando learned so much from what unfolded over the course of last season now? Is he really going to turn the corner? Because he barely put a foot wrong. One mistake, of course, during that wet, dry Grand Prix at Melbourne's Albert Park, but it got out of that. And other than that, it was one of those great weekends for Lando. We thought, this is it now. Because he's got the car underneath in that Merkel 39, he's really in a good place. He's going to be absolutely hell for leather in this title race. He's going to be the man to beat. That's what everybody was saying. But of course, Oscar Piastri has had these 2 really good weekends, one in China and absolutely this one in Bahrain, and we're going to use the word again because it was a word used by Andrea Stella post-qualifying, flawless. Not a wheel out of place, as I say, to such an extent, Oscar was barely given a second of TV airtime. That just goes to show. That just goes, I know. Well, they saw enough of Lando, in fairness, because he was in that shot. But yes, for Lando Norris this weekend, a weekend in total polar opposite to what Oscar experienced. And now we're going to go into Jeddah this weekend. And is Lando going to overcome that this weekend? Is he going to find his mojo again? Or is it going to be Oscar building on this flawless nature of the Bahrain Grand Prix weekend and really taking it to his teammate? And could we see at the end of the Saudi Arabian Grand Prix weekend an Australian in the lead of the Drivers' Championship for the first time since the end of the Japanese Grand Prix in 2010, when Mark Webber led that driver's title race at that particular stage? 15 years we've not had an Australian lead the championship, with only 3 points between Lando and Oscar at the top of the driver standings. If Oscar and Lando produce similar types of weekend performances in Jeddah, as we've seen in Bahrain, then the lead of that title race will most definitely exchange hands next weekend.
That was a very nice stat. I could have used that in the podcast as a fun question tomorrow, but instead you've used that, so I've got to think of
Got you,
something
mate.
else. Very quickly going to run through the top 10 from the Bahrain Grand Prix. Of course, Oscar Piastri was victorious ahead of George Russell and Lando Norris. It was then the two Ferrari, Charles Leclerc and Lewis Hamilton in fourth and fifth. Max Verstappen with a very late move on Pierre Gasly on the final lap to claim a pretty disappointing sixth for him. We'll talk about him in a second. Pierre Gasly for him, a brilliant P7, ahead of an equally brilliant Esteban Ocon in P8, Yuki Tsunoda for Red Bull in ninth, and Ollie Behrman going from 20th to 10th, finishing 10th and picking up a point for Haas. Another brilliant performance by him. But Max Verstappen, I mean, some pretty big words have come out by him after the race. I mean, it was just, we speak about Lando making mistakes. In this case, it wasn't Max making mistakes. It was Red Bull's technology. It seemed issues with his pit lighting, issues with his car. He came out and called Red Bull's weekend a catastrophe. That's a pretty big word from the four-time world champion.
I think, as I said at the start of this show, Nick, what a difference a weekend makes. Because if you think just how much we were eulogizing over Max Verstappen's performance in Suzuka, that astonishing whole lap, of course, which we all recognized as being one of the best for a very long time, then just a consummate drive in the Grand Prix to keep the McLarens behind him. Yes, they did trip over themselves with strategy. We've gone into great length about that particular topic, but nevertheless, Max still did what it takes to bring that car home in first place, regardless of what you think about the McLaren tactics that unfolded over the course of that weekend. But then this weekend, just again, we talk about a complete contrast. Wow, from one extreme to another, because ever since Max Verstappen got in that RB21 on Friday afternoon, well, Friday evening, should I say, bearing in mind it was FP2 that he took to the car as Ayumu Iwasa, the reserve driver, was in for FP1. He's had nothing but issues and made complaints about that car, the brake, the handling, and now, of course, what we saw in this Grand Prix, of course, climbing what is Christian wanted to describe it as a wiring loom issue over the pit gantry. That meant that Red Bull's pit stops were much slower than usual, because those guys, they still managed to get the tires on and off in a very short order. But because of the lighting system on that pit gantry, it meant both Max Verstappen and Yuki Tsunoda were affected by it, and they were not pulling out of their box as swiftly as they would ordinarily have done. So a lot for Red Bull to digest coming out of this weekend. In particular, Christian Horner was going on about the correlation issues with the tools in Red Bull's armory, between what it's got at factory, its very ancient wind tunnel now, of course, and what that the car is then doing on the track in relation to the information and the data that they're getting out of those tools. He's confident still that they can address these issues in time enough before, of course, the team, as does every other team up and down this pit lane, has to switch completely across to the 2026 regulations, because we know how crucial it will be to any team to ensure it gets out of the blocks swiftly enough next season, when we have that new car unit and new aerodynamics associated with the car for next year. So a lot for Red Bull to get on top of, but in very short order, they've got to try and do it, as I say, Nick, before 2026 really takes over. How will Max fare over the course of the next few days in Jeddah? We know it's a circuit he really likes. We know it's a circuit he's done so well at in the past. Again, to use your phrase, sorry, mate, I'm going to have to borrow it. Only time will tell.
I feel like you're doing it because I'm in Miami. It feels as the first weekend you've been using my phrase, and it just so happens I'm not in my office. I'm in Miami. Maybe it's something in the air, I don't know. But it's been, you mentioned that it's remarkable how things can change from one weekend to another. It's remarkable how much people can change from one day to another. Lewis Hamilton was so despondent after Saturday. It mumbled his way through his media pen interview, and in many ways was kind of a flip reversal, it seemed, following the race. A pretty good drive by him to go from ninth to fifth, but came out with a fascinating word in regard to his driving style and adjusting to the Ferrari, having been with Mercedes for so long. And he said that it's been alien getting to know his Ferrari based on just how long he raced with Mercedes and was so used to racing for the Silver Arrows.
Yeah, again, as you say, his mood was again total polarity between. It's just been used a lot in this update. I appreciate, folks, but total polarity between the way he was on Saturday evening, just total despondency on the floor. As you say, he mumbled his way through the interview. You could barely hear a word, and I was stood literally about 3 feet away from him and couldn't hear what he was saying. But then, much happier place. That is because he produced, in the end, what Sky Sports viewers voted as the driver of the day performance. He went from 9th to 5th, was very racy indeed in that Ferrari, looked more at home within it. But as you say, he was, and a lot of people don't really understand this. I know we've had comments below some of our videos in the past as to why should it take one driver with such experience so long to get on top of a new car compared to the car that he would have been used to with his previous team. One of the major differences, and I asked Lewis to put flesh on the bones, because he mentioned about the driving style and having to get used to, as you say, an alien type of style with this car compared to what it experienced in Mercedes. So give us more details, please, Lewis. And one of the examples that he gave was that for the first time, he never had to do this with the Mercedes, but he's having to do this with his Ferrari this season, is engine braking. So you can imagine for a driver, that is something so, if you've never experienced it before, to now all of a sudden have to try and do that with this particular car, forgetting everything else that he's having to learn within the cockpit of that car. That for him is something that's very, very different. Again, to use this word, very alien to what he has been accustomed to over the years at Mercedes. So it's still, as he's pointed out, going to take him time to adjust, to appreciate, to understand. But for now, people have got to have a degree of patience with him. He feels is trying to exercise patience as well, but he appreciates that for the team, he needs to adjust sooner rather than later. But at least he was able to pick himself up off the floor. He did say that he had to have a word with himself after his demeanor in the pen on Saturday evening. And at least he came out fighting and produced a solid all-round drive compared to what we'd seen in qualifying, where he was just nowhere and really struggling.
I guess for us normal folk, it's a bit like using an Apple iPhone for 12 years and then switching to an Android and
Switching
Samsung
to a
or something.
Samsung. Yeah, exactly. It's something along those lines, yeah.
For us normal folk who aren't racing Formula One cars at 200 miles an hour. Just finally, we've obviously gone. So we've just got to discuss, obviously, very, very quickly, Nico Hulkenberg being the 4th driver this year to be disqualified from a race. It's remarkable. 4 races, 4 drivers disqualified. And it's a really interesting one because for the second time this season, we've seen a driver disqualified for excessive wear to the plank. We obviously saw it with Lewis Hamilton back at the Chinese Grand Prix. And as we learnt in China, the plank after a race, the 3 points of measurement must all be at least at or above 9 millimeters. For Hulk, well below the 3 points, 8.4, 8.5, and 8.4 millimeters. He had finished 13th, of course, disqualified. But it's fascinating, isn't it, that with 4 races into the season now, and the fact that we've already seen, obviously, 2 drivers disqualified for their cars being underweight, and now 2 drivers disqualified for excessive plank wear. It's fascinating, isn't it, that it just shows not only how low the teams are trying to run these cars, but almost we are at that point now where they're just trying to push the limits and now going over it.
Yeah, this wasn't even close in terms of that,
not even close.
Plank wear, was it? This was pretty cut and dried, and we know when we see those submissions from the FIA come in, and it refers to a driver being investigated and a team being investigated for this black and white technical breach. You know what's coming within about 60 minutes or so. It's a slam dunk disqualification. We've seen it again on this occasion. No, Nico finished 13th, as you say, Nick. So not really much of an adjustment to the classification. Yes, everybody below him will move up, of course, but points not on the line. So this isn't as important, shall we say, as some of the disqualifications that they've seen already this season.
And of course, something to mention is that I do need the help from the fans because it is, of course, coming to the end of a triple header next weekend, which means we've got a podcast on Monday and need a fan's predictions for the Saudi Arabian Grand Prix. So if a fan can please comment below this video who you think is going to set the fastest lap, the fastest pit stop in terms of which team, who will claim pole position and the top 3 from the race. I will basically go through the comments, and whichever fan comments their predictions first, I will use them to represent the fans. Only other thing to say is please do smash that like button, subscribe to the channel. Ian, amazing stuff as always, and of course you will be in Saudi Arabia as well next weekend. Ian, Sam, and myself will see you on Monday for the podcast. See you later.
Take care as always, folks, as the forklift trucks continue to unpack around.